So sad that we can't be in person today, but I hope everyone is staying safe and warm during the snowstorm. I'm excited to introduce Dr. Ana Isabel Baptista. She's an associate professor in environmental policy and sustainability management at the New School. She's also director of the Tishman Environment and Design Center at the New School as well. Her research and practice spans several areas, including equitable climate mitigation and energy policies, cumulative impacts and environmental justice policies, and land use and zoning approaches. She has diverse applied experience from working with the New York City panel on climate change and also the New York City Environmental Justice Advisory Board, amongst many other pieces. You have access to her full bio, so I think it's more exciting to just jump into her talk, where I'm sure we'll hear a lot more about her amazing work. We're really happy to have you with us, Anna.
Thank you. I'm just going to get us in slide mode here. But thank you all for hosting me and for the invitation. Yeah, I'm sad I can't be there in person to actually meet all of you and get a chance to spend a little time on campus. But maybe another time we'll have another opportunity to be together and hopefully better weather. So I hope you're all staying safe and warm at home. So yeah, I'm gonna share a little bit about my work. And also the work of the Tishman Center that I've been directing now for several years. I've been with the Tishman Center as long as I've been at the New School University. And just a little bit about my journey over to the New School is a little bit unusual. I sort of say I'm an accidental academic in many ways because I really started out as an activist. Um, and worked for decades in my home community in Newark, New Jersey. Um, but came back to academia as a professor of practice and really at the invitation of being able to sit at this intersection between higher ed and movement work, which is work that I'm very much committed to and would have continued to try to do through the work of the Tishman Center. So I'm going to say a little bit about the work of the Tishman Center and the community of practice that I've helped to try to build in the last few years with other academic centers, and then say a little bit more about cumulative impacts work, which is not exactly about climate and climate justice, but very much related. And then share some of the work, the collaborative work I've been doing and the Tishman Center has been doing on climate resilience and climate mitigation and the implications for that work for EJ communities, particularly in this moment. So yeah, a little bit about the Tishman Center and where I'm coming from. Um, as I mentioned, I came to the New School University as a professor of practice and really with the hope that I could not only teach and try to train and shape the next generation of advocates and activists in movement work, scholars, but also to do work within higher ed at sort of this intersection of scholar activism and movement support. And the Tishman Center, we're celebrating our 20-year anniversary. So we're very excited this year to be celebrating that milestone. And in the last 10 or 12 years, the center shifted its focus and its mission to be more explicitly in line of environmental justice principles and adopting some of the EJ principles, the JEMES principles for democratic organizing and EJ principles to center our work around movement support and capacity building, and to really be a hub for collaborative research and trusted partnerships with activists on the front line of climate and environmental justice. So the New School is a great place to do that because of its, progressive values, and it gave us a lot of room and space to do that work with communities on the ground. Um, and we've taken full advantage of that platform at the New School to build a body of work in line with our movement partners and to really deepen those partnerships over these many years together. So some of the work that we've done includes supporting movement leaders. So we have a national fellowship program where we have cohorts of executive directors and sort of senior leaders in the climate and environmental justice movement around the country and the US territories. And we support them for 2 years to help them scale projects and work that they're doing collaboratively with a group. And we've done that. We're in our second cohort this year, and it's been an incredible journey of learning around how you really support leaders at the front lines and sort of leading edge of the work that they're trying to move. Um, we've also been doing quite a bit of work with partners in academia who have similar missions or visions for collaborative partnerships, building a community of practice with our partners, and also doing public engagements in large convenings where we amplify the work of movement voices and leaders, bring together multiple sectors that maybe don't typically talk to one another, and try to amplify frontline solutions through those public convenings. And then last but not least, we do a lot of collaborative research, policy advocacy work, technical accompaniment of our movement partners. So I'm going to share a little bit more about that in particular. And I wanted to mention the centering justice work because you all are a center in higher education, and so you are our peers, and so I wanted to put a little plug in, a shameless plug here, for your center to think about ways you can join this growing network that we're building. Back in 2024, we hosted our first Centering Justice Symposium. And at that time, we really were trying to call in our peer academic centers, institutes, and labs in higher ed who had a vision or mission that was really aligned with environmental and climate justice. So, in other words, they had an explicit focus on working with movement partners and doing collaborative partnerships, and they had a focus on climate and environmental justice. And so, there have been many centers over the decades who have worked with EJ groups, but in the 2022-23 period, there was a lot of federal funding that for the first time targeting EJ communities. And we saw this like huge jump in growth in academic centers and institutions jumping into the work of environmental and climate justice, some of them for the first time. And so those of us who had been doing this work a little longer felt it was important to have a sort of level setting around what are the principles of working together with movement partners? How do we build strong partnerships that sustain and last beyond funding? And how do we do that well? And so we had a symposium, and we had created a resource hub online. And now we formed a more formal sort of core group of centers that have committed to working together for the next several years. They're here listed, these 8 centers that we're building this community of practice with, but we have a much larger network of centers that are joining us at this now annual symposium. So last year we partnered with the Indigenous Resilience Center out of the University of Arizona, and we hosted our second Centering Justice Symposium out in Arizona, focused particularly on Indigenous knowledges and ways to do trusted partnerships with tribal communities. And then this year, we're going to be in Los Angeles with our friends at the Equitable Research Institute and the Urban Environmental Policy Institute at USC in Occidental out in LA in March. So I welcome all of you. If there's any of you who might be interested in coming, we encourage our centers to come and bring at least 1 or 2 partners with them, and we have some funding to support that. And we have an article about some of the work that came out of our first symposium that you can check out. So just wanted to do a little plug for that before I got into some more of the work that we've been doing. Um, and as I mentioned, we've sort of built a body of expertise and technical accompaniment over these last several years with our partners, as many of our partners in the movement reach out to us seeking support of various kinds, and it's not always research. oftentimes it's sort of technical advice, it's support weighing in on public comments or reviewing things together, maybe doing white papers together. And sometimes we produce work together with our partners where we co-author, and sometimes we are using um, our position within higher ed to publish papers in peer-reviewed journals and other outlets. And some of the focus areas we've particularly had a lot of work in and research in has been around climate mitigation, pathways that sometimes exacerbate environmental injustice. So we'll talk a little bit about that and with in this talk, and then focus on sort of cutting edge public policy for climate and environmental justice, things like cumulative impacts, which I'll also mention a little bit. We've done quite a bit of research with partners around investments and resourcing movements for impact, and then a lot of work also on public policy coming out of federal and state governments related to climate and energy. So a little bit about cumulative impacts. It's not exactly climate change, but I wanted to mention it because it's a body of work that I've spent quite a bit of my professional and personal career working on. Coming out of New Jersey, I worked for many decades with colleagues in New Jersey to try to pass cumulative impacts laws. Like many EJ organizations around the country, cumulative impacts has sort of been a holy grail of policymaking because it addresses the disproportionate concentration of pollution burdens and other stressors that communities face that are often go unanswered in traditional environmental laws like the Clean Air Act and others. And so it's very frustrating for communities to just see this constant deluge of industries that target their communities for a variety of reasons. And so for many, many years, communities have tried to push back and tried to push the envelope on laws that would address these disproportionate burdens. And finally, in New Jersey, after a lot of organizing, we were able to pass a landmark EJ law. And that kicked off a whole round of a surge, sort of uptick of states following suit with similar laws around the country. So that's been really interesting to see that growth. And as a perfect example of some of the research accompaniment we do with our partners, we try to provide resources to advocates and to policymakers around this very rapidly evolving field of cumulative impacts laws. And so we created, we started out with a sort of Excel spreadsheet that we would share with our friends and family. But then we created a much more sophisticated dashboard team at the Tishman Center, my research team, where you could search state laws and bills that are being proposed and enacted and the regulations that accompany them as a resource to show, what is emerging in the sector, what are the policies, what are the methodologies being used, all to inform and hopefully advance the passage of strong laws that protect communities from cumulative burdens. So you can check that tool out. And we also have an article in the EJ Journal about the database and some of this research. So I'm going to turn now to resiliency work because I know that was in the title. So I want to talk a little bit about that work. And um, resiliency work is so important, probably now more than ever, just because so many frontline communities are facing tremendous climate risks and threats that are just getting worse, and at the same time that they're experiencing a whole host of social, economic, and other stressors and the rollback of federal protections and investments. So it's sort of this horrible compounding effect. And so, you know, it makes sense that many communities are turning back to, what can we do to ensure that our communities not only survive what's already here in terms of climate change, but try to really carve out ways to thrive in these changing conditions. And so, my own professional and personal journey with resiliency took a turn. I was working for over a decade in my hometown in Newark in the Ironbound Community Corporation, which is a grassroots EJ group there. And at the time that Hurricane Sandy hit, And my family and my community, my neighbors, we were without power for weeks. And I had to, and like all of us had to mobilize to do mutual aid, door-to-door support. It was overwhelming. And it opened my eyes in ways that I had never imagined to the real depth of vulnerability that communities face, particularly communities that have populations that are undocumented, that are just living on the margins of um, the economy and the social fabric of how important social fabric of communities are. So I learned a lot uh, in that moment, and then in the years that followed, also about organizing and the power of regional organizing around resiliency. We looked over at New York City and they were mounting really forceful effort across civil society with labor, social services, health providers, you name it. They were coming together and in a way that some of the less organized communities outside of the New York City area perhaps were not prepared to do. And so we started to form this sort of regional approach where we work together with our peers and friends in New York City. And it helped all of us, I think, learn from the type of response we're going to need at the federal, state, and regional level to recover. So we participated in the Sandy Regional Roundtable back then. And since then, we also, many communities around the country were able to tap into funding from places like the Kresge Foundation that really shaped a lot of my own thinking and practice on how you do good climate resiliency that's community driven and community centered. And we were, able in the Ironbound community to take funding over multiple years from the Kresge Foundation to work with our local municipalities and other stakeholders to strengthen our uh, resiliency response systems in the city of Newark. So I learned a lot from all of this work and have tried to bring that forward and help advance that in some ways in the region. So continue to try to support communities across the New York City and New Jersey region who are still working on resiliency investments. One of the places that I've learned quite a bit in the last several years is through the Megalopolitan Coastal Transformation Hub. I'm an executive advisory member there, and it's been really interesting to see the work of leading scientists trying to inform really practical decision making across a very diverse range of geographies in this area we call the Megapolitan Coastal Hub. So everything from the city of Philadelphia to small little barrier island shore towns in New Jersey. So wildly different political and social and economic conditions, but facing, in some respects, similar systemic problems in terms of their capacity, decision making. It's been a real learning journey there to try to apply science in a way that helps really residents like at the household level all the way up to municipal and state level make decisions differently based on climate science for resiliency long term. And the most interesting part of that I'll mention here, there's a lot that I could say about MACH, is the temporal element of the scale of the change needed, because so many of these communities are working on a very near term timeline. And the systems changes that the science is informing require longer term shifts. So that's been an interesting set of outcomes coming out. We're actually coming to the end of the mock period. Um, then another place that I wanted to highlight here for all of you that might be of interest is the New York City panel on climate change. I was part of the fourth report that came out, and I co-chaired the Equity Workgroup for that panel, along with my colleague Sheila Foster. And the focus of that work, actually, in that chapter was to try to link up with the previous third report, which focused quite a bit. It was the first report, the third NPCC report was the first time the panel took up the issue of equity in a serious way. And there was a whole host of recommendations around how the city of New York should incorporate SOVI, the Social Vulnerability Index, and various metrics and measures of environmental justice in their application of climate recommendations. In the fourth panel, we looked back at the city's implementation or not of those recommendations, but then we tried to take it a step further in several respects. One is the panel considered the history of the city of New York dating back to pre-colonial times, so looking from the indigenous settlements in the region, and how the successive waves of settled colonialism and urban development patterns shape the resiliency risks that communities face today, and particularly the inequalities that the city faces today. So we did a very long timeline review. And then we took seriously emerging new threats that we were hearing from groups across the city around the issue of climate gentrification and climate displacement. And so we looked very carefully at the published literature on that and the evidence around climate displacement to present a series of recommendations to the city about how to tackle these related crises of climate risk and displacement risk. Um, and so we had some really interesting recommendations and findings there, one of which revolved around developing a better sense of how climate displacement works in tandem with some of the SOVI scores. So that the city, interestingly, had a very well developed displacement index score. Which came out of a local law that this New York City passed several years prior. So they already had sort of this measure across the city of displacement risk based on housing conditions, market pressures, a whole host of other data sets. We also had a set of climate risk indices from FEMA um, that could be applied to New York City. And then we have the SOVI scores, which social vulnerability index scores that the city had previously been looking at implementing. So we actually looked at the development of a combined uh, what we called CDSV, a climate displacement and social vulnerability score and index, to help the city start to target and look at areas of the city that were particularly vulnerable to these compounding risks. And this mattered for a variety of reasons because it helped shape a little bit about the investments and the types of climate interventions that the city might try to target. Because one of the fears coming out of community-based organizations, which was that a lot of the green investments and green infrastructure investments that were tied to climate resiliency were actually driving and exacerbating displacement forces in the city. And so trying to figure out how do you create anti-displacement strategies and adaptation investments in tandem was really a critical part of the recommendations we developed for the city. And I'll just say one last thing on resilience, which is that we at the Tishman Center have been working very closely with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation now on the last couple of years to help them continue to build out this model of climate resiliency hubs that they had already invested in for some years. Robert Wood Johnson was a funder for the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice in the Gulf South and the Center for Engagement in Environmental Justice and Health at the University of Maryland, where they had set up two climate resiliency hubs that basically would support the regranting of a network of groups, grassroots groups in the Gulf South and Mid-Atlantic to do resiliency-based projects. And we came in to try to help them expand that network to two new regions. And the two new regions are in the Midwest with the Center for Earth, Energy, and Democracy out of Minnesota, and in California with the Communities for a Better Environment. And we helped sort of develop this framework around like why regions are important in the sense of resiliency, the role that they play in terms of the existing social network and fabric of movement organizations that can work together to shift policy and also work across multiple sectors, including the public health sector, to make systemic changes and investments in climate risk mitigation. So we're working right now with all four of the partners on creating a data-informed blueprint for how they're going to build these networks, and also using story-based narrative strategies as well. So we're providing some technical support and accompaniment to all the partners in this effort, and be excited to report out how that goes. We're just getting started and launching, but would welcome any thoughts that you all have also in this sector, because I'm sure you've been working with groups, maybe perhaps around some of these issues as well. So more to come on the resiliency hubs. Um, and then in this last part of the conversation, I wanted to bring in some of the work that we've been doing on climate mitigation. Now, climate mitigation, interestingly enough, is an area of work that I see there's not as much work and advocacy that comes out of the public health sector on mitigation, probably a lot more in the resiliency side and adaptation side. And our counterparts in the mainstream environmental organizations have obviously shaped a lot of the climate mitigation and climate agenda for a long time. And as a center, we have engaged with climate mitigation as a partner for EJ groups who find themselves often at the margins of like policy making on climate change, and where equity and environmental justice is often an afterthought. And nowadays it's, become like a dirty word, climate justice. But even prior to this, the idea of climate justice or environmental justice in climate mitigation conversations was often relegated to, payments, some equity benefits on the side. The goal was like reduce greenhouse gases, reduce CO2 by all means. And often the means didn't consider the full breadth of implications for Egypt communities. In other words, the climate mitigation pathways we pick today will have immediate impacts for the communities that often host the energy infrastructures that we're mitigating. And so if we pick pathways that don't consider justice and equity implications, we just perpetuate a system of inequality. So, climate justice calls us in to consider all of those things. And, we, as a Tishman Center, we joined a platform that was formerly known as the Equitable and Just National Climate Platform back in 2018. It's now been rebranded as Platform for a Just Climate. And at that time, it was the first time that we had all these major environmental organizations, some of the largest environmental organizations shaping national climate policies, and environmental justice groups coming together to shape a national agenda centering climate justice in climate mitigation policymaking at the national level. And it was wildly successful. It informed the Biden administration's first 100 days. It helped inform Justice 40. There was a lot of investment that went in for the first time into environmental justice that came out of that collaboration. Um, Unfortunately, we we also saw a lot of investment in what many or communities called false solutions, and the pathway to climate mitigation. And as the Tishman Center, we found ourselves responding to requests from communities around the country who were now grappling with this very rapidly emerging set of quote unquote climate solutions that potentially could harm their communities. So even if they worked, and there was a question always around how effective some of these proposals were actually climate mitigation, but even setting that aside, communities worried that some of these climate solutions were going to sacrifice their communities in the short term. So one example of that is the support for carbon capture and sequestration and hydrogen co-firing for the power sector and other sectors as well, that was being proposed by the federal government and by lots of different sectors as a necessary climate mitigation response. And industrial carbon management has been around a long time, but now was being sort of packaged as a climate mitigation solution that needed public investment and support on a large scale. And it meant that communities were now facing significant investments in infrastructures that could increase co-pollutants, and potentially entrench fossil fuel industries and other interests in their communities. So, community said, hey, we're trying to understand these proposals. We're very technically complex proposals. We're being pressured into signing community benefits agreements. We don't even understand the risks. And no one's talking about what are the gaps and risks in the science on these technologies. Because most of the published literature in these sectors was very much heavily informed by engineering, hard sciences and industry-backed publications. So there was very little in the literature that was looking at the critical perspectives and equity implications of this work. And so our center quickly had to, jumped in with others, with many of our colleagues, to try to make sense of some of these and help inform the EJ communities that were facing these proposals. So we published in peer-reviewed journals. We did white papers. We did infographics, you name it. And we did even, more public-facing things like podcasts and op-eds, because what our partners said was our voices get marginalized because we're not considered experts. And so our opinions and our fears and our experiences get really get shirked in these conversations. And so we felt it was really important, and our partners felt it was really important that we stepped in as in our position in higher ed to assert that, in fact, the observations and experiences and expertise of local partners should not be taken lightly. They should be taken seriously by scientists, by researchers, by scholars, and others. And so we did a lot of policy work and advocacy work in support of our movement partners in this space. Yeah, so I think that's it. I wanted to leave time, I know, to maybe have a discussion and hear from some of the questions from all of you that in areas you might be more interested in learning more about. And I'm happy to go into more detail on some of the places I presented in the PowerPoint slides. And my center told me, show the slide, for the follow us. I don't even know if I have all of these social media connections, but you're welcome to subscribe to our newsletter at least and check out our website. Thank you all.